class.
That's right. No
Okay, everybody, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this great day that we're going to be talking about federalism. This is a great topic, a really interesting topic, and one of my favorites because we can see it happening all around us every single day lately. And so we're going to dive into all of that. We're going to start with the history and the foundation of federalism in America, where the heck it is in the Constitution. We're going to look at it over time, and then we're going to end up and say, where is federalism in our life today? So get your chat box open, get your Q&A ready, and we'll get started. I'm Kerry from the National Constitution Center, and I'm here to help you out through this walkabout in federalism. Any questions you have, please let me know please let me know what they are in the chat, and I can help you answer them. Or if you want to use the Q&A. Now, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Nick Mosvick. He's one of our top scholars, and he's going to walk us through federalism. So, Nick, you want to say hi, do an intro, and let's get started?
Sure. So I'm Nick Mosvick, and I am I'm one of the NCC's senior fellows in constitutional content, and I have both a PhD in American history and a law degree. So constitutional history is my specialty. And lucky for us, or at least lucky for me, federalism happens to be one of my specialties. So I'm very excited to do this class, so let's get started.
So Nick, we're definitely going to try to stump you today and ask you hard federalism questions. But for all of us to make sure we're on the same page, can you start with a simple question? What is federalism, and where is it in the Constitution, and why did they think it was a good idea and put it into the Constitution? And when I say they, I'm talking about the founding fathers writing the United States Constitution. So start us off with that base framing. What the heck is it?
Yeah, let's just go through those really quickly. Let's answer them simply, right? Federalism, let's just keep it simple. That's the division of power between the state governments and the federal government, right? Keep it at that simple, basic level, right? The second question is, where is it in the Constitution? The answer kind of is everywhere, right? When we get to separation of powers, which we will talk about soon in the near future, we'll talk about the same way. We talk about something we call the structural constitution, right? Meaning it's within the structure of the Constitution itself, but also in the text. So there are many examples of this, right? The Commerce Clause, for instance, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which come up under Article 1, Section 8, which gives all of Congress's powers, the enumerated powers. Kerry has several other ones for you, which were really important actually to what we talked about last week, which was ratification, what they're debating about, things like the powers of the federal courts versus the state courts, right? That division of power. We've already talked about the Fugitive Slave Clause, the Rendition Clause. We've mentioned privileges and immunities before. That has to do with the treatment of state citizens between different states, right? The Supremacy Clause, sort of that is it says, right? Federal laws are supreme, right? Therefore, state laws do not trump federal laws. That's a very key federalism principle in terms of the division of power between the two. And then the third question that Kerry asked is, why did the founding fathers put it in there? Well, the answer sort of is because they had to, because state constitutions already existed. And the expectation was for most people that the only constitution they would accept was ones that didn't necessarily destroy or minimize the existing state governments, if that makes sense, right? It's because they existed and people were not willing to completely give up their powers, right? Because you have to understand, we talked about this last week with ratification, right? How does ratification happen? Recall that we talked about state ratification conventions, right? They happen at the state level, right? So people have their representatives, but the states are doing it, right? There's representatives of their people. That's actually really important, right? So states operating for the people are not also going to cede too much of the existing power that they have.
So that's a good framing. So it's the balancing of power between a big national government and a state government. Why do we have it? Well, before the Constitution, states had all the power. So they had to give some away to the national government, but they didn't want to give it all away. So they balanced in between the two. I actually love this graphic because it kind of it shows kind of how this balance happens. And Nick, is it true to think that depending on what the topic is, these weights can shift and go up and down?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, I even mentioned like the Commerce Clause, for instance, great example of this, right? is one question that the court has been asked and answered since the early 19th century is what happens if the federal government doesn't do anything, but the state tries to in some way regulate interstate commerce? Can they do that? And the answer is it depends, right? Depends on what they're trying to do. Depends on, for instance, if it's Maine trying to regulate lobsters that may be in waters that are shared. What happens then, right? That's a hard question. And it was treated as a hard question. But that's where you would see that balancing. The other thing I mentioned, which we kind of have to, right, is the Articles of Confederation, you would have seen this balance be this way, right? The states would have been way up. Because under the Articles of Confederation, part of the reason they wanted to replace them is the states they thought retained too much power, right? Whatever that balance was, they thought it was completely unbalanced, but now in favor of the states. The national government couldn't really do much of anything. You can't rely on state governments to do everything, but people also want to rely on them for some things, right? So that balancing is important, and it's worth keeping in mind that the Constitution is also trying to rebalance an existing imbalance in their minds, right?
Yeah, so it's like, it's not just balancing, it's like pendulum swinging too.
Yes,
like
exactly.
States had too much power, now we're swinging it over to give the national government. And so we need to find that sweet spot in the middle.
You feel the anti-federalists come and say, whoa, that's swinging too much that way. Let's bring it back this way, right? That's the argument.
Yeah, so you always want to kind of level in the middle. Okay, so when we think about this, let's start with breaking it up. Let's start with the federal government. I know when we talk about federalism, we talk about the national power, the state power, but can we just take one beat on the local? Like, how does the local work out in this kind of splitting up of power and dividing of power, which a lot of people, a lot of teachers I hear talk about how federalism divides power vertically between the national, state, and local government. And I really like that because, as I promised you, Nick, I would bring up the idea of a parfait during this conversation, that it's a balance of power like a parfait in different levels. And there, students, is your reference to Shrek. If you're a Shrek fan, there's the parfait reference. So can you kind of give us a hint, kind of, you know, what is the level that stays at the local level when we're talking about federalism?
Yeah, I feel like I'm reaching for almost a different metaphor, just in the sense that the local governments, what they can do is mostly a decision of the states. And what the states can do, where they're limited, is decided in some ways by the national government and then the national constitution, right? If you're thinking of those levels, right? In other words, a lot of what local governments can and cannot do is not only a matter of state legislator, but the state constitution, right? It's a reminder that, by the way, we have state constitutions. And those state constitutions say a lot of the division of power. There will be states in which the local governments looks wildly different from other states. I think of Virginia, the place where I had to study for the bar, and how counties and cities are completely treated differently under the law because it goes back for centuries. In other words, it was never replaced before or after the Constitution. It stuck around, and it was simply a matter of state law, and then the local governments kind of decide how they allocate their power between cities and counties. State government, state courts have the ultimate decision. Yes, sometimes the Supreme Court reviews things like that, but generally speaking, local governments is a matter of state constitutional law as opposed to federal constitutional law. And I think it's in that sense that it is a matter of federalism, right? Because it's coming from the states, not the national government, principally what local governments can do. Now, the limitation ultimately is, of course, a local government still can't do things that are unconstitutional, is a matter of the fundamental law of the nation. But beyond that, right, state constitutions have a lot to do with it.
Awesome. Okay, so now let's jump to the national government and like break down kind of the rules and the powers. So what is on the national level? So just to clarify what you said right there, which was perfect, was, you know, the local and the state governments cannot violate the supreme law of the land, which would be the Constitution. That wins. That's the umbrella. That's the big level. But then on the state level, on the national level, power is divided again. And so on the national level, what is the job of the national level? I love this graphic. It breaks it down really nicely, but can you do a walkthrough?
Yeah, just this, again, a simple breakdown, right? Because we've talked about this a little bit in previous classes, right? We've talked about the three branches. We've talked a little bit about separation of powers. And Kerry mentioned, and I think this is helpful, right, is thinking sort of the vertical and horizontal separation of powers, right? In the sense that federalism is the vertical separation, and then you might say separation of powers is the horizontal in terms of at the federal level, how that power at the national government is allocated between the branches. But then they still have a relationship, if you think of that in that graphical sense, with that vertical separation and division of power with the state governments, right? So each time one of the branches does something, there's frequently a federalism question. We brought this up at the beginning, right? The courts are, I think, a sort of an easy example of this, right? Because there are federal and state courts. There were state courts before the federal government, right? That was part of the debate over the division of power between the two. Congress controls ultimately what kind of cases those federal courts have. That's also a decision of that allocation of power, right? And it means over time that the federal courts have been able to do things like review the decisions of state courts and review state laws to make sure that they are not unconstitutional under the federal constitution. So you can see how that's an example of federalism in action under Article 3, right? Article 1, what Congress does, I think that's even clearer, right? In the sense that we talked about the Commerce Clause as an easy example. Taxes are too, right? Taxes, laws dealing with economic regulation, right? Now we deal with things like healthcare in the modern age. Those are all pretty classic examples of a federalism issue in which you're talking about controlling things that happen at the state or the local level through federal action. Congress does a lot of that, right? The president can certainly do that too. Although we'll talk about the presidency soon, where that class is coming, talk about the difference between making laws and executing them. But of course, executing laws certainly can also be a question of federalism too. And of course, maybe the more obvious one is what the president can do in terms of ordering. For instance, can he ask governors to do certain things to carry out federal law? And you can think of that as a federalism question, right? What happens when the president calls the governor and says, I need you to bring the National Guard out? That is a federalism question, right? Because the state governor controls the National Guard, which used to be the militia, but that's the state military unit, right? So you can see again that those are all examples of how this happens. And those are questions that come up all the time. So as Kerry said at the very beginning, federalism is all around us, and that's not an old thing, that's very much today's issues, right? We're talking about things that happen all the time.
I think that's a really cool way to think about it. So federalism, you can start with saying whose job is it, and watch how the job is, what we say horizontal across the national government or the state government or the local government, because it's broken up in the same way at the state level. But then also, do a federalism check. Like, okay, the president wants to do this, Congress wants to do this. What is the federalism check? So when we talk about other ideas like separation of powers, you're seeing it in the process of federalism. When we talk about checks and balances, you're seeing it. So on the state level, we have this three kind of pronged attack as well. But one of the questions, and I think it's a really good one that came in the chat, and this will get us into the states and the national government. So let me, Iman asked it, great question. How were state legislators supposed to elect senators, and which house of the state legislature elected the senators? So really hard, but good question. But one thing I want to do before we get into that I forgot, and let me just say it before I go further. We talk a lot about the Commerce Clause, guys. I love the Commerce Clause. It's like Pee Wee Herman's Playhouse that I always scream when we talk about it. Think about commerce as like the change of money and the change of products over state line. It makes sense that the national government would say, we're going to step in when there's multiple states involved and things are moving around and things are being exchanged over state line. If we go back to our colonial period, Articles of Confederation, we remember that we were taught that that's where things started to fall apart. So that's when you'd say, okay, we'll give the federal government, the national government, a job to oversee that because multiple players are involved. It's not just within one state. So commerce, think like changing of money, commerce, exchange of money, exchange of goods. And then it starts to make more sense why they would have that job. But back to this great question, how do the states work and how did they work in connecting with state legislation and senators, so we can see kind of this in action on the state and national level.
Yeah, I'm going to use it as a question to go back to and talk about a little bit of the history, because I think this is worth doing. First, I'll go and clarify for Amy about the National Guard as well. What I meant by that is that was a change over time. So the state militia, and this will kind of go to Iman's question as well, which is this was an original unit of state citizenship even before the Constitution, right? That the military started with the duty of state citizens to be part of the militia, right? The collective unit that would defend within the state and that could be called out by the national government for defense. And the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 provides for that. So does Article 2, provides for calling out the militia in certain times, right? So the militia was the state military unit. That became the National Guard roughly at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a series of acts in which Congress changed the language and started treating it as what they called the National Guard, which was more or less secured by 1916, I believe, just before we entered World War I. But the point there is it changed. We now refer to it generally as National Guard. People don't really talk about the state militias anymore. That's what I meant by it. Voluntary Army, that's great to talk about too. To get to Iman's question, that's a great question, because like I said, we're kind of talking about the original configuration of the states. And this is really important with talking about the original allocation of powers, is that part of the reason that the anti-federalists were so upset about the new Constitution and why they talked about what they called consolidation, this notion that all this power was going to be centralized in the new national government and that its branches were going to work together to increase that power, is that they were going to take it from the state governments, right? Over time, they were going to create a tyranny and destroy the state governments. And what they meant by that, they pointed to a lot of examples. But fundamentally, what they're also saying is that, look, when it comes to democracy and the democratic character, it's state and local governments that are more responsive to the people than a faraway national government. And the duties we have in citizens, they come locally and at the state level first. And that includes jury duty and militia duty, right? Those were central to what they called Republican citizenship. And so it's there that they thought it made sense, right? If you have this notion of equal representation at the Senate. Remember the great Connecticut Compromise, which is Senate is equal representation, all state gets 2 senators. The House is done proportionally, right? Why would it be done by the state legislators? That's the idea, is that they represent the people even better, right? And they'll select the best people and send them to represent them. Because as Madison talked about in Federalist 10, there was a very common idea in that at the time of ratification and the writing of the Constitution, that virtue was really important. And we could find these virtuous people, these citizens who would represent everybody and be beyond their own self-interest, right? They would be disinterested in the sense that they would represent the whole people. And that's exactly what senators should be. And so this is a way of trying to explain, this is why they thought it had to go through the state unit, right? Because that was the best way to do it in order to ensure this disinterestedness, right? This virtue. State legislators, it depends. The reminder here is at the time, states could freely choose, and I think this would still be true. If they wanted to have a unicameral state legislator, they could. They get to choose how it is that they would have picked. There was nothing that said there was only one way that they could have picked their senator, chosen how the representatives, the state legislature did so before constitutional amendment changed that in 1913. So that would have been a matter of states. So hopefully that answers Iman's question. But I think, like I said, it was a way to also talk about this original division and why state governments were so important to that generation, right? Where that concept of that was.
Got it. Okay, and that helps kind of clarify. I just asked everybody, like, instead of everybody's now guessing.
17th Amendment, yes.
Yes.
The 16th is the income tax, 17th is direct election of senators.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew where that one changed. And it's I always think it's going to be an earlier amendment. I always
Yes.
think it's going to be closer to like the 10s, but it's not until the 17th.
And remind yourself of something, Kerry, it's worth pointing out, which is before that amendment passed, a lot of states were already doing it, because that's the point, is that the states could choose to change how they allocated representation, and they could choose to just simply follow direct election in the sense that whatever the popular vote was, we would go with it.
So
We'll get to the electoral college, but it's the same thing, right? A lot of states already chose to do so.
So now you're going to bring me to the point of why. Why did they do this? Thank you, Nick. That was a perfect transition.
Yes.
And why did they do this? Why did they want, and you said it earlier, and I thought it was a really, really good point. Like, the states are so different. So allowing people in Florida to say this is what's best for Florida, allowing people in Pennsylvania saying this is what's best for Pennsylvania, that part makes sense. But there's another reason. And Brandeis brings it up. So can you talk a little bit about this idea of the laboratories of democracy? And it wasn't just about home rule is better rule, but this idea that things could be tested out in the states and that would benefit the nation at times, at least the theory of that.
Yeah, well, and I think to me, it's analogous to what Brandeis thought about free speech and free expression. Now, we'll talk about the First Amendment again at some point in the future. And when we do so, I think it's our obligation at the National Constitution Center to talk about Louis Brandeis and the First Amendment and freedom of speech. But in any case, the analogy is similar, right? In terms of his concept of freedom of speech was one of, look, it comes from liberty of conscience. And so we have to have this open exchange to know what are good and what are bad ideas, right? We have to flush them out. And that can't be something simply decided by the national government. So the laboratories of democracy, I think, is a similar analogous idea in the sense that it's that, look, we have 50 states. And we have 50 laboratories, therefore, to experiment with what are good and bad policies. And part of the reason we do is because we haven't talked about this yet, but states kept certain powers. That power is something we now call the police power, but don't let that throw you, right? Police means something different. It's an old term. It simply means basically regulation, right? And the idea there is that states had more power to regulate for the benefit of their citizens in terms of health, morals, and and I'm forgetting the third one, but in any case, right, to do things for the benefit of their citizenry, right? That kind of classic regulation we think of in terms of health, right? That's the big one now, but that's very old. The idea that states were the places where they could freely institute things like quarantines and even what are kind of old versions of not stay-at-home orders, but something like that, right? Something akin to that. Nuisance laws, things like that, right? States did all that. And so they experimented with what worked. And I think that's what Brandeis was getting at, is that the federal government, and therefore the Supreme Court, shouldn't interfere if they don't have to, if it's not doing something to abridge the federal Constitution, because over time, we learn what works. And frankly, it's not just that the federal government learns, it's that other state governments learn, that he's making the observation that states will follow other states. And I think history bears out that that largely tends to be true, that if something works and several states start doing it, it builds a movement. And sometimes that means national change, but sometimes that means that the state by state change was most effective. And so his point was simply that federalism allows for that freedom to do those things because it actually is beneficial to all of us that happens.
And a nice example of that is the women's right to vote. So we were talking about how many amendments that we all know, and I'm impressed if you guys do know the Bill of Rights, because that's a lot. But to add another one to your list of things, you know, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, or women's suffrage movement, meaning women fighting for the right to vote. So Nick, before the 19th Amendment, how many states were letting women vote?
To be honest with you, actually, I think off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
It's almost 100%. We'll just say that.
Yeah, no, it's like, I think you're looking at it there, but I think I want to say 18, but I feel like that's wrong.
It was, it was a great example of Brandeis, the movement across the country.
Yes.
I mean, women had voted and then it was pulled back, but a lot of states were moving forward. But then the amendment came along as well. But it was this idea that states were giving women the right to vote and other states were saying, you know, that's actually working for them. That's doing a lot of good things and that's what's right. So let's do it. So it's great examples. Now, as we kind of get into this and we have about 10 minutes left, the one thing I want to give our kids, and we'll do a real quick dive on this, but, you know, federalism says, here's what the national government's job is, here's what the state government's job is, here's what the local government's job is. But there were 3 amendments that really shifted the power. And I want to just really quickly, do you want to dive quickly into the Reconstruction time period and how Civil War changed the power structure?
And I'll just say, for what it's worth, that with the 19th, it's because for one, I should know, but 2, it's because states varied in terms of how much right to vote they gave women. Some states gave them the right to vote generally, some limited to things like school board elections, to just presidential elections. So it sort of depends. So it's kind of, how do you count that?
Yeah.
Depending on how you count it, it looks like a lot more states actually gave women the right to vote before as a federal thing. And that explains also how it gets ratified, right? How the movement coalesces. But it starts with states and it starts in the West, which is, I think, worth noting. It's Wyoming, it's the Western states, that Utah as well, Colorado. Those are the first states to Montana to give women the right to vote. In part because, frankly, it helped to bring families out to settle these states where nobody was going to live. The Civil War, I think it's really important to see it through federalism. Let federalism be the way of understanding this essential conflict in American history. The reason that's true is, of course, one, what is at the heart of the Civil War itself. It's fundamentally over slavery. Yes, there are other related issues, but fundamentally it's over slavery. And slavery is a matter of state law. So part of federalism originally means that states also had the power to decide whether or not to have slavery within state boundaries. Territory was different until Dred Scott, which is why Dred Scott's important, because it actually federalizes or nationalizes slavery in some sense by moving the ability of Congress to at least take slavery out of territories, or for states to recognize freedom from another state to have to do so. Remember, we talked about Article 4, that's a federalism issue. Dred Scott is a federalism case, right? And I think it's really important to see it that way. Abelman versus Booth is another one. Students are not going to know Abelman. Most college students, law students don't know Abelman. But it's important, I can say that very quickly, because it's also about how states resist. Northern states at this time were resisting something called the Fugitive Slave Act, talked about in previous classes. Why is it important? Because it made Northern citizens have to be part of the recapture of fugitive slaves. And some Northern states, including Wisconsin, resisted this. The Wisconsin Supreme Court struck down the act as unconstitutional. It's an amazing thing. And it went to the Supreme Court, and it's the same person, Chief Justice Roger Taney, who wrote Dred Scott, who writes Abelman. And this is why, if you hear people say it's about states' rights, you tell them about these cases, because he said, no, federal supremacy. And therefore, the federal courts only get to decide if it's unconstitutional. State court can't intercede here. So they took that away because of something that came out of Northern resistance to slavery. How does that set up the Civil War? Well, again, that's at the heart of it. It's at slavery, and it's about the difference between state and federal law and how things would be nationalized or not nationalized. And how does the North win that war? It becomes a national effort. It changes people's understanding of the Constitution and the national government and its role. And it makes them, in some ways, more suspicious of the ability of states to do the right thing in some sense, right? Because after the Civil War, we've had the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which gives freedom to slaves in Confederate territories. Then we have the 13th Amendment, which follows that up by eliminating slavery forever in the United States. But the old Confederate states that come back in, they institute something called the Black Codes. They say, hey, that state power is still there, nothing's changed. we can still regulate people within the states. And therefore, we can make Black citizens have as close to no rights as possible, right? We can take away their ability to defend themselves, to work freely, any of those things, right? To travel as well. And so that becomes a problem for Congress, who has to think about the next two amendments, right? I've talked about the 13th Amendment, which also refers to something called the badge of inferiority. That's actually really important language we never talk about. They think maybe that gives us power to protect the civil rights of African Americans who are now free. They passed something called the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And it's maybe one of the most important pieces of legislation ever passed in the history of this country. It's incredibly important because what it does is says, first off, it essentially establishes birthright citizenship. And then it gives a flurry, a list of rights to be protected for all people who are citizens. The right to make to own property, to make contracts, to self-defense, to owning guns, right? The Second Amendment is now for everybody, right? That's really important. But they also think we might need a constitutional amendment. There's two reasons for this. One, they're not sure they had the power in the first place yet. And two, they're worried about future Congresses. What happens when the South gets political power back and they decide to get rid of this? A constitutional amendment, that's permanent. So we need to take the principles out at the heart of this thing we just passed, the Civil Rights Act, and we need to make it stick forever. So that's Kerry showing the language of it. Section 1's now what's most important to us. We talk about things like the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause, and then the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Those are the three rights protections within the 14th Amendment. There's also the Citizenship Clause I already mentioned, which establishes birthright citizenship. But the real fundamental change here and idea here is now the federal government, the state governments, protect the essential civil rights of citizens throughout the country. That is a significant change that cannot be overstated because it's actually what was argued about in courts and elsewhere from the very beginning of the 14th Amendment. Did it really change federalism that much? Well, that is a crucial question, and it's the one that the Supreme Court immediately fought about in the slaughterhouse cases. So, Kerry, I don't know if I should explain that or should I answer a modern question?
Yeah, let's go to modern because we have 5 minutes left. And
yep.
Let's be honest, the slaughterhouse case, it hurts everybody's brain. So I think we need a whole 30 minutes just for that case alone. Look it up, guys. And yes, I'm saying the word.
Given 30 minutes on that case, so.
Give it slaughterhouse. And we will talk about these amendments in more detail, but what I wanted you to see is—
Can you sum it up in a sentence, Kerry? Slaughterhouse cases? Eliminates half the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, it basically waters down the 14th Amendment, so it basically has no teeth anymore. But when you look at these three amendments, and this is the part that I wanted you to pull from this, when we think about federalism, we see that and you saw me like highlight it, Congress is given more power. Congress is given more power. Congress is given more power. That's what I want you to remember. It's not just what they wrote in 1787. It's also these amendments, and it also how the court interpreted it. Whose job is it? And where are they given more power? Under what areas? And that's, Nick, that was perfect. Under the idea that you are allowed to have equal protection of the laws and equal rights in this country, 14 gives Congress more power. Now, the question that we'll get into in November is, did they do it? Did they actually use that power they have? Did they not? And slaughterhouse comes out there. But let's talk about federalism right now. So should we go to the big question at the end? Do you want to go there? Do you want to look modern?
I'll just say really quickly, what Kerry is talking about is what we call the enforcement clauses. And she's right, they're very important. And they actually come in a moment of great irony, purposeful irony, in fact, from a 1842 case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, in which a Pennsylvania law, which interfered with slavery in some respect, called the Personal Liberty Law, which basically meant state officers and citizens couldn't be made to help recapture fugitive slaves, was overturned by the Supreme Court. And what Justice Story said was that the national government has a duty to provide a remedy to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause. And he said other things that are important. We don't need to get to them. The point is, that the Republicans in 1866 took that and they said, let's turn it around. They literally, that's a quote. One of my favorite quotes is, we'll take the machinery of slavery and use it against it to destroy it, right? That's an outstanding quote, but it gets out of the heart of it. They turned it around. They said, okay, the idea there is the right one, which is we have to provide a remedy. What is the remedy? Enforcement. Who does the enforcement? The federal government. So that's the essential point, right? Is now who carries out these rights? Who can pass laws? What courts can enforce this? The answer is the national government.
So now let's fast forward. We have 2 minutes left. Let's do disaster, because it's always my favorite. Natural disaster. And so I don't know how many of you guys are from a beach town or a coastline, because sometimes it's easier to see beach towns in this, but we can also look at wildfires. We can also look at a lot of national disasters and go back to federalism and say, whose job is it, Nick? So we can talk about elections, and I know in the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about federalism and whose job is it for elections in more detail, especially next week when we look at the Electoral College. But can we do a real quick federalism, whose job is it activity on a natural disaster? So go, Nick, 2 minutes. You can do it.
Is there a particular natural disaster you want me to use as an example? I guess wildfires is the example.
I think I would use wildfires because I feel like Katrina might be like, all the kids are like, I don't know that one, even though it feels like in our lifetime, but not maybe in all of our students' lifetime. So wildfires, whose job is it?
Because right now it's an example too, right? Because they're not in one state, they're in multiple states. The
Perfect.
effects carry over in multiple states, right?
Yep.
So it's not contained in a single state, but state agencies act first, right? State National Guards get called out, state emergency workers, fire jumpers, people like that, they get called out.
So the governor of the state that calls out all the resources and tools that that governor has in that state, and that's EMTs, that's fire, that is police, and that's National Guard. So that's whose job it is to make first move, right?
That's the first move. And then they, in this case, it's true. Then they call the federal government. You call the president, which they do. And they did in this case. I know that's Governor Gavin Newsom, at least I know for sure he did, to say two things. One, I need help in the form of people. So that means FEMA, for instance, which is, Federal Emergency Management Association or agency, and then to give money, resources, right? Is one, we need money because there are Federal Reserve funds, there are emergency funds that in these cases are called on and then relinquished. That's why they're there for. And then there's people too that are called in to help, right? I used at the beginning an example too of calling up the National Guard. It's the same thing. Because typically the situation is not that the federal government or the president says, I'm intervening. It usually is the state governors that do so, that they ask for it, that they ask for help. That's actually federalism in action, because it's the state that starts the process typically, because there are more constitutional questions if the federal government starts it, right? If they try to use one of their emergency powers as opposed to the states asking for help. So hopefully that helps to suggest how this is supposed to work too, is that, and this is Laboratories of Democracy. This was the only other thing I was going to say, is it's like the idea that the states and the local governments, the local people, they know the conditions best. So the person who can best assess what we need and what we need right now is not the federal officials, but the state people who can call and say exactly what they need for help, and then to call out federal resources. So that's the way it's supposed to work.
Got it. So there's like a chain of command with these issues, and it goes with who's ever on the ground first. So if it was something that wasn't statewide, something like there were protests in Philadelphia, it's the job of the mayor to then call the state. So that's where the mayor, so the local leader, local voted in leader would be the mayor. They call the state level. Do they ever jump and go right to the president? Or does it usually follow that chain of command?
It has happened, I think, yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's not just today. I mean, the protest today, that has happened. Usually it is the governor, but sometimes you hear mayors talking. But you can see that in the 1960s with the civil rights movement as well, in terms of who Lyndon Johnson and President Kennedy was talking to at times, for better or worse, depending, because the president also would have to call, I think, the mayor of Birmingham, if I recall. Maybe
I was going to say, it reminds me of school desegregation.
Yeah. But also governors,
Yep, it was the mayor was involved, the governor was involved. So think about it, guys, when there's an issue in your community or your state, whose job is it? And what is the chain of command? That's part of federalism. And the idea behind that is, if you're the one in charge on the ground, you know what's best for your community and you know your people the best. So that's the idea behind it.
And that's a great example, just to say quickly that the president wanted to put pressure on the governors mostly because that's where the pressure matters, to say, look, do something about this mayor, do something about this sheriff, or we'll take away funds, or we'll do something to punish you, because I can't command you most of the time. That's what the president can't really do as a matter of federalism. He can't, there's not much he can command, but he can threaten in ways. And usually the best person to do that with is the governor, to say, hey, talk to the people under your direct command, get them to stop doing this, and enforce the Supreme Court. That's what Kerry's really talking about, is they had to do something to enforce Brown versus Board. Yes, the Supreme Court announced it, but then a lot of states did things to resist it, and localities resisted it, which is also a federalism issue too, is what do you do about that?
Exactly, and what levers do each level have to pull? So the president can pull funding for education and say, well, if you're not going to do it, you don't get this. Among other things. Okay, so that is an awesome wrap up. If you guys do have a chart where it says local, state, and federal, you can start kind of seeing that, you'll have multiple things in different boxes, but how they use their job and what they can and can't do, and the chain of command changes too. So thank you guys so much. It was a great class with everybody.
Thanks for the comment, by the way. She correctly identified Jim Crow laws. And that's an example too. Laboratories of Democracy goes both ways.
Yes, Laboratories of Democracy, that's the one I always love to say, like, it's a good in theory, but doesn't always work good in practice. Thank you guys very much. Have a great day, and so nice having you in class. See you next time. Bye. Amy, yes, shoot me an email and I'll loop in Nick. So great question. If you guys ever have questions for our scholars, you all have my email address from the email that you got from Zoom. You can shoot me an email and I'll loop in Nick or Tom. Thank you guys. Nice to have you in class today. And there's the official announcement.